further ado, here's a man who is well positioned to share with us insights. And what I want to do with this, Steve, is focus really on two things. The broad strategic challenges that we face in the United States, and they are substantial, but maybe start with the people, all of whom you know well, who are going to be the team in foreign and national security policy that are going to shape the second Obama administration and its approach to the world. So let's start with that. How do you sense this team shaping up? And is it really fundamentally different from the first team, and where's it going?
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be back in Colorado Springs. I loved my time here so much with all of you 2 years ago. I was itching to come back, so when Sky said, will you come back, though I sort of went AWOL, covering a presidential election and the conventions, and we organized a couple of big conferences ourselves in the Atlantic, and I sort of disappeared on Sky, and I said, you still want me? He said, yes, come out. So January. Yeah, we'll make January our every year month.
That's good. Got it. A deal. So, you heard it. It's on tape.
Let me also say, because you're all interested in international affairs and foreign policy, and I think you want to get a flavor of what's going on in D.C. Some of you are former Foreign Service people, and there's just no way to do what I do without just letting you know that I'm one of the people that most people outside the Beltway kind of hate, because I like the D.C. cocktail party scene. The D.C. cocktail party scene is where all secrets get passed and people schmooze, and you hear about all the corruption, or you hear what things are happening. But fundamentally, it's like the other branch of government. And last night, and I sometimes get accused for name dropping. I embrace it because there's no way to tell the story without doing that, and it's quicker. But last night there was a dinner for the Saudi Minister of the Interior, Prince Nayef, who just succeeded his father, who just died, who was the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And last night you had this very strange dinner where there was no welcome. We all had cranberry sparklers. And there was a head table, and at the table were Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft. You're the Brent Scowcroft Chair at the Air Force Academy. Tom Donilon, who's the President's National Security Advisor. John Brennan, who is up for being CIA. It was the power crowd, and there was no speech. And I was seated last night between the ambassador of the UK to the United States and the ambassador of France. And because the Saudis weren't speaking, we decided to entertain ourselves, and we talked about Mali. And Mali, there was just a big invasion there this last week, the last couple of days.
Small little skirmish.
The French have invaded Mali in their own Afghanistan-like attempt to keep Mali from falling prey to an al-Qaeda group. So we can get into all of that, but I just want to say that in the DC scene, which many of you know, this kind of thing happens. Cocktail parties about Mali, and the next moment it might be why the Saudis aren't giving a speech, or why somebody's wearing a bad tie. You just don't know. But let's get serious about the president's choices. President Obama came in, and I manage in these talks to pleasantly offend just about everyone as we go through. So. President Obama came in as a person who was doubted in his skill and ability on foreign policy and national security issues. Even though he'd been on the Foreign Relations Committee, he was looked at as relatively inexperienced. In fact, when he was beginning to run, when he was running in 2008, he made a trip to Afghanistan, also Israel and other places. And with him on that trip, he took Senator Jack Reed and Senator Chuck Hagel, who was then very much and clearly still a real Republican. Whether he is now may be another thing.
Please define real
but
Republican.
He definitely was then. So they had Hagel and Reed on this. And at the time, I had been very interested in the changes that we were going through geostrategically after the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. And I had commissioned a book in my role at the New America Foundation by Brent Scowcroft and Zbigniew Brzezinski, so two former national security advisors, one Democrat, one Republican, in a moderated conversation with David Ignatius, who's a well-known Washington Post foreign affairs writer. This book was called America and the World: Conversations on the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. And it was designed to be a primer for whichever president won. So whether John McCain won or Barack Obama won. And Brent Scowcroft's only instructions to me, when I convinced them all to do this, he said, whatever you do, we did this as a set of edited conversations, get the book out in the summer, so that you can get the galleys before it's out on the street to each of the candidates and their teams to read. Chuck Hagel, who had become a good acquaintance of mine, was willing to take the galleys, the unpublished galleys, and give Barack Obama this Brzezinski-Scowcroft book on the plane before he'd won the election. And it's really one of the proudest achievements. The New York Times, Michiko Kaktani, who some of you may recognize her name as the leading book review editor of the New York Times, picked it not in the just top 100 or top 10 books of that year, but her favorite book of the entire year. So I can't tell you as a guy who's sort of in a think tank, policy wonkland, how great that was. But people matter. And so the question is, when Obama came in, what did he do? He kept Bob Gates in place, because Bob Gates was a steward that brought in. That created a lot of continuity, but Bob Gates was himself, while he had been a steward of the issues with the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, he was largely a Scowcroftian critic, a Scowcroftian skeptic, if you will, of some of the exercises. He believed there was no military solution to the conflicts we were in, and that we needed to have much more diplomacy and other elements of statecraft deployed in these issues. And so you kept Bob Gates in. You had a revolving door at CIA, and more revolving than I think they expected if we had not counted on David Petraeus leaving so quickly. But and then you had many things like extraordinary rendition, secret prisons, stop, allegedly. You had Guantanamo, we can talk about that, attempted to shut down, but you had a lot of congressional problems with that. But we had the expansion, of course, of the drone program. So and so we want to come to the drones. Barack Obama has picked Mr. Drone, who is John Brennan, the guy who's been creating kill lists with him every morning, who helped make the hard decisions to go after Osama bin Laden, who decided each morning to go after a US citizen, Alaki in Yemen, and who's been part of this. And there is, of course, a great deal of controversy about the drone programs. Yes, they've disrupted many terrorist activities. At the same time, they've also killed many innocent people. And that is a very complicated nut. There was a book many years ago by Chalmers Johnson called Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, but written before 9/11. But the idea is America sometimes, when it steps here or there, creates stresses, and those stresses can come back and be revisited. So without getting in all the gobbledygook, we have John Brennan, who's up for CIA. We have John Kerry, who is the second choice that President Obama had to be Secretary of State. Susan Rice was very clearly the first choice. That didn't work out. We can talk about why. I felt really guilty about this. Any of you know Susan Rice? I love Susan Rice. I don't think she would have been as good as John Kerry will be. She will be good. We're on tape. She'll be good. But I hosted the meeting where Lindsey Graham and John McCain basically mugged Susan in a very unfortunate way in a conversation with Jonathan Karl of ABC News at the Washington Ideas Forum. And then Jonathan literally ran from our meeting down the street, down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, where there was one of the rare presidential meetings and press briefings. And Jonathan said, Lindsey Graham and John McCain just said this, will you respond? And Obama then responded. And it was Obama's response to McCain and Graham that made this basically a nuclear bomb, and then took it out. So John Kerry is at stake. Joe Biden keeps his vice presidency, and one Senator Chuck Hagel has now been nominated for Secretary of Defense, and because he had such a dandy meeting with Senator Schumer of New York yesterday, who had some concerns, but Schumer put out a press release saying that he is inclined, lest there be some new thing that comes up, to support Hagel's nomination. So Schumer was really the last hurdle. There'll be surface noise, and Bill Kristol, prominent with Weekly Standard and Fox News, will continue to boil over about this, but it will have little traction in terms of what the result is. And it's really a fascinating exercise. So what you have is you've moved, and this has become a cliche, I was one of the first people to write it, you've moved from team of rivals, where Hillary Clinton, former presidential candidate, very focused on a different strategy in national security issues, where water, development, women, non-traditional kinds of conflict, climate are designed in her world. Digital diplomacy is another big Hillary Clinton hallmark. Aren't part of the classic national security spectrum that one thinks of with John Kerry. So one of the big questions is John Kerry going to consolidate and continue to be inclusive about the development, the women's issues, the poverty issues, the sort of left behind areas of the world that don't get a lot of attention. Those are the areas that Hillary Clinton really invested a lot in. And we don't know. Or is John Kerry going to be someone whose ego, as a former presidential candidate, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, demands that he's in there at the table with the big guys, who's involved in, whether it's negotiating hardcore with China or dealing with the aftermath of Afghanistan, or if there's some crisis with North Korea. In other words, I just want to put on the table, and it's not politically correct to do this, that Hillary Clinton, to some degree, brilliantly maximized a crappy situation in which she was frequently excluded from inclusion in some of the larger, big national security issues. Because the president views himself as his best national security advisor. And the key decisions that the team has made have been very, very insular and close to the president in those morning meetings with the team. So John Brennan will be out there. He won't be in the morning meetings every day with Barack Obama. Part of his job, I call him the sort of Joe Kennedy of drone warfare. And what I mean by that is Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy's dad was somebody who made an awful lot of money manipulating the stock market, insider trading, and manipulated the stock market before there was a really adequate regulation in the 1920s. And he was made head of the Securities and Exchange Commission by Franklin Roosevelt because he knew every dirty trick in the book. So to a certain degree, John Brennan's job is not only going to be to keep America safe with dealing with non-traditional, non-state actor war, what I call gray war. He's got a job which is to basically figure out what the rules of war need to be in this area and codify it both internally and actually begin to look at how do you begin doing a deal with Russia, China, but more importantly with England, France, other great nations. So you've got to get other states to largely subscribe. Why? Because everybody's going to have drones in 5 years. Pakistan has drones today. China has drones. It's not an insurmountable technological leap. And once you have that, while they don't have the same intelligence framework, they don't have the same geospatial arena, imagine Google Maps times 100 that the intelligence services have. He's got to codify that. John Kerry is loved. I mean, part of why Lindsey Graham and John McCain went after Susan Rice is that they love John Kerry. He's a pal, a buddy who didn't betray them like Chuck Hagel apparently did. And so knocked out Susan to get their friend, and he will have no problem at all. He's just coasting right along.
Before you go on to Chuck Hagel, let me frame this, because I know you want to talk about Chuck. He's an old friend of yours. But let me frame this in a way, because the first term of the Obama administration seemed to me was one about, if I can put one word to it, it was engagement. It was redefining America's relationship with the rest of the world.
Right.
And the perception that we had gone our own way unilaterally and had not engaged much. But as you say, it was also a team of rivals. This crowd is seems to be much more uniform or consistent in their
Senate Foreign Relations Committee guys. Yeah, guys.
And well, I won't go on the gender side, but because you said Susan was the first choice. Well, that's right. But it seems to me, and I'm just inferring from what you're saying, that this is more about how do we make the kinds of resource cuts, and I know you'll get into this, a transformational way of mobilizing the instruments of state policy in a way they're going to be heavily dependent upon defense in the intelligence world. And would it be fair to say that John Kerry is not going to be a visionary taking us in new directions in terms of the impact of diplomacy?
No, I think John Kerry actually potentially has a lot of capacity to recreate and transform the deals. What America needs to reinvent its power in the world is not to exist on old institutional arrangements. So yes, we helped create the UN. Yes, we're the lead in the IMF. But listen, our power in those cases is resting on old institutions that haven't really been reformed to recognize the new rising powers in the world. What John Kerry can do, if he is as smart as I think he is he can be a turbocharged diplomat who gets out and crafts a new global social contract with many other leading powers in the world about how we need to run the system. What does responsible international stakeholding look like? And he's got to do that, and hopefully he'll find his place in it. For those of you, I'm sure many of you have met John Kerry. John Kerry is a great leader, great thinker with no lack of self-confidence. And he's now got a lot of confidence in what he wants to do, but he won't have nearly the budget that Chuck Hagel has, right? So Chuck Hagel now, once he's confirmed, has more money than God.
And will he have the ear of the president?
Well, he has more money than God even when they slash his budgets.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
But will John Kerry have the ear of the president?
John, yes, if he manages a judicial. I mean, look, my favorite line I said on Wolf Blitzer's show once was, and people were talking about, does somebody have the ear of the president? You don't really know. Barack Obama is a cat, and Joe Biden is a golden retriever. And you never quite know if Barack Obama is going to talk to someone. There is a senator, I can't mention who, he's a Democratic senator. He is a bit of an independent-minded Democratic senator, but every Democratic senator is important when you're trying to push the legislation through. And this Democratic senator has a habit of straying every once in a while into territory you're not supposed to go into as a Democrat. And one would think in that case that the president would spend some time with him, talk to him, give him an Air Force One plane ride now and then. Hasn't talked to him for 2 years.
This wouldn't be a Democrat from Connecticut, would it?
No,
okay.
no. He's an independent. I'm a registered independent. You're talking about Joe Lieberman. Yeah. No, they hang out. Joe Lieberman and Obama get along, actually. But Obama, in my view, to improve his administration, he sort of, was asked the other day, is he going to now party more? As he's criticized as being too insular. Jackie Combs of the New York Times asked him 2 days ago whether he can do this, and he said, well, now that his daughters are growing up and don't want to spend as much time with him, that he's lonely in the big house, and that he needs to get out and socialize more. Part of the social glue of Washington, whether or not, what the president did say, and it's true, is that whether he and John Boehner go play golf, John Boehner's still going to, pound him and do it because that's what his constituencies call for. But the thing that I think the president misses is that in the art of diplomacy is sometimes seeing something that wasn't there before, that didn't have a chance to happen. And if you're not really engaged with people on that level, you miss all sorts of opportunities. You also miss hearing where people are really thinking and what they're at. And so in the team of pals that have now coming in, and remember, Susan Rice is still going to be in a cabinet level appointment at the UN, and there is a chance that in a year and a half, she could come in as National Security Advisor, most likely, which is not a position that needs to be confirmed by the United States Senate. So that would solve a lot of boxes that gets checked. And then I think that Michelle Flournoy, who is a very clear alternative to Chuck Hagel, continues to be out there as a prominent defense intellectual. And essentially what the Democrats need to do, and one of the reasons why I think Chuck Hagel was so attractive to the president, Hagel was attractive to the president because Hagel does not, how do I put this politely? He's very blunt, and he does not often agree with the president. He's courteous, he's whatever, but they have a lot of differences. And when you're president of the United States, you're essentially a temporary monarch, and not that many people challenge you. One of the reasons why Barack Obama lost so dramatically to Mitt Romney in the first presidential debate is that the guy hadn't been challenged in a fundamental way by anyone for 4 years. We had organized at the Atlantic a program called Women of Washington, and I was the only guy there, but I was the moderator between a discussion between George Bush's former political director in the White House and Anita Dunn, who was the communications director for President Obama. And so I asked them both what would be the biggest mistakes that both made on their side. And Anita Dunn said before, listen, nobody challenges Obama really, and he will be soft. And he will, and she called it exactly right. So Chuck Hagel, in these meetings on Afghanistan, he's co-chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. So he's been dealing with him about a lot of our dysfunction in the intelligence community, and also how to begin to better partner intelligence capacity technology to the national security challenges we have in order to leverage them more. I think one of the really interesting times, if I may, that we're back, this is a deja vu, because we're back in the period when George W. Bush came in. The Bush administration was facing massive defense cuts. Does anybody remember who the defense secretary was then? Well, anybody? You do. Don Rumsfeld. Yeah, Don Rumsfeld,
Mr. Transformation.
Yeah. What do we know? What do we don't know? The unknowns. Don Rumsfeld was my hero before 9/11 in a way, because the challenge he had was to reinvent how you talk about national security and the deliverables from the Pentagon in keeping the world safe and America safe, while facing a tsunami of defense cuts. And that's when he began talking about the revolution in military affairs and applying technology to the defense platforms we had and creating greater synergies and efficiencies. But at the end of the day, our footprint in national security around the world would be greater, better, and we would live in a more secure world. I've been waiting for Leon Panetta to say anything even a quarter like that. I like Leon. Leon is someone I consider to be a friend.
Well, wasn't Leon supposed to be the cutter? Because
he was the cutter who can only talk about cutting.
Right.
And so the way he would talk about cutting and austerity made people think, oh, we're going to have less security. So Chuck Hagel's job is going to be figure out how to make these decisions, wrestle with the generals and admirals, figure out how you make responsible defense cuts that don't cut into the skeletal structure of America's security infrastructure, but basically come out with a plan where you've got a transformed military. 9/11 hit, and the era of hard choices ended, and every defense budget was floated up. So you funded everything, and we got kind of fat and sloppy to a certain degree in national security issues. Now we're back into a period of how do we be lean and mean and create efficiencies and create a very interesting and different Pentagon. And I think it's an exciting job. So Hagel is looked at by the president as someone who has that stature to be able to do that. The Democrats, when they came in, and I apologize to many of you that are in that world because I'm sort of rough. The Democratic strategy when Obama was elected was that they couldn't, everybody knew Barack Obama was against the Iraq War and was this community organizer from Chicago and probably skeptical of the military. And it says, so what did they do? They needed to create institutions. The Center for New American Security, the Truman National Security Project, and these became the Democratic Party's Pentagon-hugging operations. So it wasn't going to be about cutting the military or reforming or transforming. It was essentially about giving soldiers, giving the Pentagon increased budgets, doing everything they can. So they're not well positioned. So it's ironic that today that the leading Republican guy is actually the guy you send in to do the cuts, because the Democrats aren't yet in to do that. I once had a talk with Michelle Flournoy years ago about weapons systems purchases and weapons acquisition and technology development, and I asked her, Michelle Flournoy was one of the alternative candidates for this, a very, very capable,
she had been Assistant Secretary of Defense for international
policy. She was the number 3 person. And I have enormous respect for her. I really think she would make an outstanding candidate for that something. But I asked her, I said, what do you think the error rate is? Like, how much do the weapons guys get wrong in terms of really bad decisions, vested interests, corruption? What do you think the figure is? And she said, about $30-40 billion a year. Which at the time, because this was a long time ago, is a huge number. It's less of a huge number now, with all of our, when you're talking about trillions now instead of billions. But $30 or $40 billion a year as an error rate, as a round, as a problem. And then she made the comment, but it is a wonderful machine what we produce. It is a magnificent generator of some of the most, and she's right, some of the most innovative technological leaps that you've ever made. So the error rate is worth it. And that's a profound statement. And it kind of tells me that that person is not somebody who's going to be excited about cutting programs, right? So maybe the president has made a very good choice here in terms of moving someone who's going to be blunt, who's going to have the stature, the credibility with the combat troops. So you're thinking about the soldiers having fought in Vietnam and having come back 44 years ago under very tough circumstances. But he's knows intelligence, and he's no shrinking violet. And so you need somebody who's just going to, deal with roughness. I mean, I think part of the reason why the president put him out, on the end of a stick like a marshmallow over flame for about a month, was just to see if he could take it, because that's what it's going to be like. So,
Well, let's shift the focus from the personalities. You never can escape them, but let's shift the focus from the personalities to the broader strategic choices. I mean, on one level, one could say it's a convenience, the wrong word, but a convenient or relatively predictable strategic shift because it's concurrent with the withdrawal from Iraq and the imminent withdrawal from Afghanistan. So clearly there are opportunities for defense cuts pivoting towards Asia and so on. But then the other question is, given the size of the cuts and the economic challenges and all the things going on from Mali to whatever, does this team and does the administration have a sense of the kinds of strategic choices that it has, or is it simply, we just got to cut, and we got to do so in a way that pretends like we're not cutting?
No, I mean, to give, oh, you're wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry.
It's not vodka.
We can arrange that.
No. Look, to be quite serious, I think every leader has flaws, but I think in this arena, President Obama and his national security team, which includes Tom Donilon, the advisor, Dennis McDonough, who's very close, have been very focused on trying to balance two things. Coming in to responsibly manage what they inherited from the Bush administration, not to be reckless or walk away from it. That's why there have been a lot of accusations of continuity. What is continuity? It's responsible management of things that were going on. But I got to tell you that many command staff generals and admirals that I've known, many people in the sort of national security strategic class in Washington, never believed that we would leave Iraq. And we left Iraq. And they never believed, and many of them until about 2 months ago, believed that we would, that Afghanistan would, because we did leave Iraq, absolutely never leave Afghanistan, that it would be Korea, and that we would keep large bases there to preempt any overthrow of Kabul and to keep a hand in the Israel-Pakistan mess. And so the strategic class got it wrong because they didn't realize how the president had made a calculation. He made a deal with the military when he approved the surge of the 30,000 troop surge in Afghanistan, which is, and he was serious about it. The military didn't think he was as serious as he was. The deal was, I'm going to give you these troops. They wanted 40,000, he gave 30,000. You gut punch the Taliban. You try and shape the circumstances there, and there's a time limit. Do what you can with these soldiers. I'm listening to you. Well, the military took that, ran with it, and thought it wouldn't really have to let those soldiers go and would keep them. And the president did something you don't see many presidents do, which is saying, no, we're drawing that back because it hasn't worked. And we're going to draw down those numbers, and we're going to bring them back. And when you watched, how many of you watched the Karzai Obama press conference? Some of you. Wasn't it kind of weird how neat and clean it all was? And, Karzai, I don't know, he must have taken his meds or something. He was so polite and easygoing. It was warm and fuzzy Karzai. It was otherworldly for me, because anyone who's been to Afghanistan or paid attention to what's going on realizes there's a return of warlordism. Many of the provinces are up for grabs, very unstable. As you get into districts, there are competitions for power. The Taliban is a much more fractious, divided, complicated outfit than people realize, but there's a real struggle, and part of the problem is that there'll be areas that keep the gains they've had, and there'll be areas that don't. And you had no sense of that from that conference. Now, why is that? Well, the president is negotiating hard with Karzai, and he's committed to punctuating either the end or a serious drawdown. I created the Afghanistan study group some years ago. It was very controversial at the time, brought in a lot of prominent national security people to come in and say that this notion that you get large security deliverables in Afghanistan from a large military footprint is ridiculous, and it's backfiring, and you are generating as many so-called Taliban or insurgent combatants and they are rising proportionately with the level of troops that have gone out. There's a problem with that. And by the way, the more you invest, the more troops you put in. I got Grover Norquist during the debt ceiling debate to go on Jon Stewart's show. Grover's a friend of mine. I'm sorry, folks, he is. And I don't agree with him on taxes, but I got Grover Norquist to go on Jon Stewart on the comedy show and say, we're spending $120 billion in a country with $14 billion of GDP. He says, does that make sense? And the conservative support for the Afghanistan war began collapsing. Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard, Max Boot, who was the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, attacked me and Grover Norquist, saying, what do these guys know? And it created a divide in conservative circles, and the divide was enough for many conservatives to look at this and say, the returns to the United States, given the investment we're making, given the lives that are on the line, are too weak. And by the way, China and Iran, not that we're at war with China, but we are kind of in a testy situation with Iran, essentially look at us as tied down, and American power is trapped in Afghanistan, not being leveraged in Afghanistan. So as we've withdrawn, as we've drawn down both in Iraq, guess what? Iran, I'm not going to say, it's all rosy, much more concerned about American military assets today than they were a year ago. And when you basically look less militarily overextended, so the strategic choices of shifting and downsizing from an area of the world that will not really matter in terms of growth and gains and innovation for the U.S. economy for a very long time, versus the Asia-Pacific region, which will matter enormously. Most of global growth between now and the next century is going to happen overwhelmingly in the Asia-Pacific region. And Barack Obama's and his team's comment was, why are we over-resourcing certain areas and under-resourcing an area that's so vital to us as China is rising? And by the way, China is declaring sovereignty over the whole South China Sea. Shouldn't we be worried about that? Do we not need more military platforms, bases, alliances, talk, attention? And I think that Barack Obama, it's very hard to shift because there are some people who really benefit. When you came into Obama administration, you were a Cold Warrior, right? Yeah, you were like Mr. Cold War. You edited Air Force Academy volumes.
They told me I won.
You knew Soviet and strategic studies. If you wanted to be really high in the foreign policy ladder for all of you cadets and you want to scholars, model UN people, the old days you had to know about the Soviet Union or weapon systems, the throw weight of warheads. When you came into the Obama administration, and you were Jim Jones, who was also at the dinner last night, Carl Eikenberry, our ambassador there, Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, died about 2 years ago. These people were the top of the national security establishment. Why? Because of Afghanistan. They were all Afghanophiles at that point. Now no one wants to be in the Afghanistan. It's like the forgotten puppy. It does not want to, no one wants to be near it. It's toxic now for a career if you were tied to Afghanistan. And that's how major the shift has been in terms of the attention and focus of these issues. So what the president is doing is he's changing and sending signals. You need to be a China expert. You need to be involved in Asia Pacific, because even though we may be pinpricked in Mali, there may be a Gaza-Israel crisis. There's a horrible civil war in Syria. And yes, President Obama is going to limit the degree of vulnerability and exposure in those issues. And I think you'll see whoever Obama's successor is, Republican or Democrat, maintain that same posture.
What I want to do is turn this to you all here in a minute, but I want to toss, before we totally shift to Asia in terms of the U.S. strategic pivot, I want to take you back to a conversation that you and I had a few years ago with a mutual friend, Bill Benter. And in thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, there was, and in fact I think somehow, probably through you and other sources, the phrase made its way to the Obama campaign. A phrase that we talked about, Israel-Palestine is something we typically don't address until year 7 of a 2-term presidency, and it needs to be addressed in day 1 and not year 7. Well, now we're in year 5, and nothing has really happened with that. And the Middle East isn't going away no matter what strategic pivot. So say a few words about that, and then we'll turn.
Because there's going to be less.
The one thing I know about Steve is it's not hard to have a conversation because I just ask a question and he goes, right?
Yeah, no.
So, but say a few words about the Middle East and how that process has come to a screeching halt.
Well, the president on day 1 did in fact
confront
confront the Middle East with the appointment of George Mitchell as his envoy, right. And he just did it badly. President Obama, in 3 UN General Assembly speeches, made Israel-Palestine the spotlight of those speeches. He really believed that he hired a team that could come in and change the calculus for this, and he believed that the support of the Saudis for what was called the Arab Peace Initiative that would normalize relations between Israel and 57 other nations if they kind of went back to something like 1967 borders with swaps and a number of other issues with right of return and whatnot, was a doable deal. And what he tried to do was essentially get the Palestinians to agree to certain things and to get the Israelis to agree not to expand settlements. And he got into, he was naive, he got into a sumo contest. Any of you know sumo? Big fat guys in Japan push each other out of the ring. It's just one versus the other. And what he gave Netanyahu was a fantastic opportunity for Netanyahu to cut Obama down to size and to become lionized in domestic politics with someone who had essentially become president of the world. So remember, when Barack Obama got elected, he was president of the world. The world loved him. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing. Right. I mean, just by being himself, and the Cairo speech. But fundamentally, you know, he came in and he set expectations that the world would be very different. But when President Obama focused so much on closing settlement expansion, something I happen to agree with, he nonetheless set a dynamic where the Prime Minister of Israel was able to create a very big focus on that while you forgot about all these other issues that surrounded it. And I felt very badly for the president in this way, but he ultimately had to walk away because the dynamic was such that he had two fundamental problems, that and starting and having a direct feud with the prime minister of one of the countries he was trying to deal with. And on the other side, on the Palestinian side, the strategy was not to focus on reconciliation of Hamas and Fatah or to try and create some equation way to do it. It was how to make Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestinian Authority, look like the provider of resources that would channel through him. So they were trying to make him look legitimate and like the winner, the provider. But the more we did that, the more we delegitimated him and more we built up Hamas's popularity. So we did things that actually undermined the very process that we were trying to achieve. There were people like Brent Scowcroft's, Big Brzezinski, Carla Hills, Thomas Pickering, Paul Volcker, George Shultz, James Baker, Sam Nunn, very prominent national security personalities who have been trying through the entire beginning of the Obama administration to get him to take a different track and to look at the Arab Peace Initiative and to create more of a neighborhood approach where he would lay out soft expectations of what a deal would look like from a presidential perspective, and then have the political establishments in Palestine and Israel largely deal with that, but to realize that neither Israel nor Palestine's political establishments could ever take the weight of a real deal, that there are too many benefits to being a negative rejectionist and very few positives of actually bringing it together. So you actually have to create a contraption that they can blame for doing the unthinkable and doing a deal. And every time I heard Secretary Clinton or President Obama or Vice President Biden say, we can't want peace more than they do, is BS. Because we, of course, did, because their loss and failure was strategically consequential to us because it was there. And the fact is that their political establishments couldn't take the heat of it. So you had to marry. And we had a great opportunity because Israel is scared of Iran, but so is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the GCC countries. And so you had an opportunity with a shared concern about a rising power that was rising in part because we knocked out Saddam Hussein, the key thorn in Iran's side. And so you had an opportunity to get rivals, nations that hate each other, and for various reasons, because of the Arab Street, couldn't talk to one another, because of the Shia-Sunni divide, and because of a shared concern about Iran's nefarious networks and activities in these various countries, to try to bring them together to talk about common security concerns. And to do so in a way, we had this in Asia years ago with something called the ASEAN Regional Forum, where even Taiwan and China would talk, Japan and the Philippines. Different parts of the equation that normally couldn't talk to each other found that there were moments where they would want to talk to each other. And that's missing in the Middle East. Well, the Middle East strategy now is New Orleans. It's a New Orleans levy called the United States and U.S. security relationship around Israel, protecting it from storms in the neighborhood. That'll work for a while, but unless the storms get bigger. And so you've got to do something to either mitigate the storms or keep investing in the levee. That's the problem. And I think President Obama got guided down a path by his team of never, ever seriously deploying or thinking about the Scowcroft, Brzezinski, Hagel council. That's why it's remarkable that Hagel's getting this appointment, because he was part of the crowd trying to get the president to take a different track. But the people that the president hired to come in to do this, the one area that they completely squelched from consideration was the Scowcroft, Brzezinski, Hagel, Thomas Pickering view in this, and they blew it. So I think that it is now, I used to believe, as the president did, that to solve Afghanistan, to solve things that were going on in the Middle East, to basically, there's a way to approach terrorism, but terrorism is a tactic, but terrorism is essentially actors. Bin Laden, Zawahiri, whomever, are performers on a stage trying to look legitimate in the eyes of a public by grabbing grievances, the United States, humiliation, whatever it may be, and killing a lot of people and trying to get affection or support from a community to do it. Our strategy has to be to kill the actors on the stage, not necessarily to steal the audience. And I think the United States has to steal the audience. And one way to have done that is to have delivered on the Israel-Palestine track, but we just failed. And I don't think at this point that it's likely in the near term, until we're in the 7th year of an 8-year term, that we're going to get our nose back in it.
Something for our students to figure out. All right, where's Fran Pilch? Okay, you had a question. And I'm going to repeat for the benefit of the cameras. The question from Fran is, what are we overlooking as we survey the world around us? What are we not thinking about? What are we not paying attention to that we should be paying attention to?
I'm not sure my answer will surprise you. We tend to think about countries. We've had a talk tonight that dealt with mostly classic national security issues. If we were to go on for hours more, which I'm happy to, as long as we have some drinks, Russia, China, reform of the United Nations, dealing with the Middle East, what's really out there? Cyber and issues that we are putting a lot of attention to, but we rarely talk about them in these forums. But the whole digital nature of disaster is a new arena of concern, serious concern. And when you see things like Stuxnet, which Israel and the United States helped develop to basically impede and sabotage Iran's nuclear program, you realize that that kind of deployment of technology is something at some level. I always worry when I see something like that, or see a superior capacity of the United States in something like drones, because I know ultimately the other guys are going to get them. You set up a barrier. So I worry a lot about the kind of race and the tit-for-tat growth, but the electronic and digitization of hate, as my colleague Robert Wright would have called, is an area. I think another area that we also talk about, but we never talk about it in terms of strategy, are the competitive forces in global economics now. The fact that states are not moving to US-style market economies, but are moving increasingly to nationalization of oil and energy, and very mercantilistic strategies in terms of using their pipelines and oil and gas to get various kinds of political behaviors done. This is something that worries me a lot, because the rise of state capitalism that's connected to capital markets. So your sovereign wealth funds are often in the most illiberal regimes in the world. Large capital markets are dependent on those, and I worry about those issues. And then I worry a lot about another dimension, which is we've been dealing with the front end of non-state actor behavior in so-called Middle East-style terrorism, right? That's been in our movies for a long time. There are going to be a lot of other non-state actor players that evolve, that to develop other kinds of ways to disrupt societies. And you need to think about those things. They require kind of antibody fix, if you will. So, I'd like to say, okay, we haven't talked as much about China as we should and what that really means in the rise, but I really do think that the next tier of serious national security issues are going to be fought in this new realm and thought about, and the American public is not yet tuned into that, and it will take some time to inculcate America with that, because we're just thinking very different frames. So,
other questions? Yes, sir. Question is an excellent question. Will the United States attempt to improve its influence in Africa as China tries to improve its own influence in Africa? And is there a competition there, or are we going to leave the field? I'm paraphrasing.
So are you old enough to know who Bono is? It's a legitimate question. Stand up.
Was he the president
of Ghana?
Do you know
who Bono is? You don't know. I knew he didn't. So do not mock me.
It's okay.
Ask later. I moderated a really cool dinner about a month ago with Bono and about 30 people, and I was asked to moderate it, and we were discussing essentially approaches to philanthropy in Africa, where he's very involved in helping the One Campaign and various sorts of things about how to deal with everything from HIV/AIDS to empowerment, women's empowerment, kind of a broad swath of issues. And he and I share the view. I'm mentioning him because I feel like I need help, because I believe American influence in Africa is almost nil, and China's influence is huge, and not a lot of people realize that. So add that to the list of of issues not paid enough attention to. China is today, for mercantilistic reasons of wanting strategic assets and whatnot, is doing what we did in much of the world in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It's building infrastructure, airports, telecom facilities, and it is not worrying about corruption, but it's essentially the level of investment and involvement is creating the middle classes in these societies that will be there 20 years from now. So the networks and the influence exchange that goes on between China and Africa is going to be rather huge. And how are we approaching Africa? We approach Africa as a kind of Sunday itch, a philanthropic thing to do because of our Christian ethic of wanting to help other people. China's trying to make money. And Bono put on the table that America needed, if it wanted staying power and legs and to change the calculus, needed to find a greater nexus between self-interest and business and whatnot, and setting up those practices, and the philanthropic side, because China doesn't care about the philanthropic. Although he said in most of the refugee camps that you see across Africa, almost all of them have labels that made in China, etc. So I would put it to you that this is one of the areas that America is blind to how insignificant we are. We are the Gates Foundation, the United States. George W. Bush is a hero in much of Africa because of the investments that he made in HIV/AIDS, and was really an incredible thing. That said, it doesn't turn Africa into a successful continent. It doesn't turn the states into successful societies, and there need to be much more development of human capital, they need inbound investment, and that's not just coming at the same level from the United States as it is from China. So my argument is that we need to catch up with China, realize that it's a strategic asset that we shouldn't lose, and take it back, if you will.
Excellent
And Bono
question.
agrees with me.
Well, and there you go. We had some other hands in the back. Let me just rephrase for the recording. Reports in foreign policy that Syria has used chemical weapons in its own country, and how does the United States respond to that as we try and pivot away from some of these things and not get entangled? These things do happen.
Very good question. The report that came out a few hours ago by Josh Rogan in the Cable in Foreign Policy, and Josh is a great reporter, and it is a secret cable that he somehow got access or was told about. So there could be mistakes, there could be a gap, we don't know. So now we have to see if the administration admits to the secret cable that Josh Rogan has written about. No one else has written about this yet. If Syria did in fact deploy chemical weapons against anyone in this, and there were rumors that they had before, and there, in my book, and I don't know what the administration would do, there has to be some sort of response. Now, whether that's a drone response, whether you get in with some sort of covert, you've got to create some sort of penalty on the command staff that was responsible for that decision. And my guess, because they don't want to get American troops and American systems involved in the middle of what is turning out to be a horribly nasty civil war that's only likely to get worse, not get better. And how do you keep the larger strategic equities? And it's horrible what's going on in Syria. The question is, throwing a military into that doesn't stop the horror, and it actually could cause greater consequences. If I were the administration, and I'm sure there, John Brennan and Dennis McDonough and others are probably spending a lot of time looking at what proxies they can use, if any, to try and create a really serious penalty on players in the command staff there, and then telegraphing that out to other nefarious players in the world. That is what I would advise. I don't know at all. This is a new report, just came out a few hours ago, and I don't know what they would be doing. But to have no response after the way they talked about it and lined up troops, or talked about the mobilizations of concern, about the potential move of those chemical. We saw, or we thought we saw,
drew a red line
chemical
there.
weapons. Yeah, we
Did
drew
we-
a red
we did-
line.
we drew a-
That means there has to be a response.
Right.
The question is the response a flamboyant one covered by CNN and all of the world that sees some, massive dramatic action, or is it a surgical one that basically goes after and tries to cripple part of the command staff function that was responsible for that? My bet is it's the latter, not the former.
Excellent question. Yes, sir.
Well, the
The
Russians,
question is the Russians who have a naval base in Syria.
they might be the Soviets again, but
Yeah,
they're
they-
not yet. Yeah.
But they were Russians before they were Soviets. But the Russian Navy has been active. The question is, the Russian Navy's been active in the Med over the past couple of weeks. Is there a connection with this, and how do we play with this? This is not just
There's a
obviously an
connection.
issue
What
of Assad.
Vladimir Putin is doing is doing things. He's doing two things. One, he wants to look big to his own people, and one way to do that is to frustrate the United States. And if you can get away with it, you sort of look like you're part of a reborn moment of stature and prominence for Russia, which, while rich, is a demographically collapsing country. Russia is a failing country in many, many ways, and so it's sort of you shouldn't underestimate Russia. It has lots of nuclear weapons, has lots of military capacity. It's very rich. I thank God it's rich. I thank God that there are high energy and oil prices, because what Russia would be doing is you'd have a lot of Russians out putting WMD materials, nuclear materials, chemical materials out on the black market to do that. So their wealth is actually inhibiting something, but they're not fixing their society. So he's doing that. But the other part of it is that Russia is playing a classic geostrategic game, which is they are negotiating with us for something else. So if they create a little trouble, believe me, they're not really deeply into Assad. Syria falling, or saying it's a blip, it's a wart on Russia's list of concerns. But if they can basically exact a price from the West, not only the United States, but from Europe, in some other area of concern, maybe it's ballistic missile defense, maybe it's a concession on other kinds of things. So I think that the Russian position is one that is essentially posturing like in a card game, but it's not a serious opposition. That said, if you did have a conflict, if the United States did jump in, and we have a complication here because we have Turkey right on the border, and in the 1990s, Turkey put 500,000 troops on the border. You've got 3 million Kurds inside Syria, and by the way, Kurdistan, the Kurds in Turkey as well, are all beginning to talk a lot more about how the Iraqi experiment with Maliki and democracy is not working, and they only signed up if they got a genuine democracy. And Maliki is failing, so Kurdistan is flirting with an independence movement again. And should that happen, you could have this Syria conflict turn into a Kurdish independence project that begins to involve security issues that involve both Syrian rebels, Salafists, Kurds, a lot of violence inside Turkey, which, by the way, is a NATO member. And we are incumbent in certain circumstances to come to Turkey's defense in NATO, kinds of little World War I-ish in some of this. And so these alliances that we have that do provide a lot of security when you do have something that gets out of its boxes and out of its lines and territory can become very messy and dangerous. So Russia's there, I think, just to negotiate. Iran is a very different case, where Iran, in my view, is essentially the owner and the controller and the chief patron of Syria, and Iran is also apparently providing some of the arms. A lot of the arms for Mali, and Mali for the Al-Qaeda groups are coming from Libya. But Iran's involved in a lot of bad stuff. And Russia being on the edge of it, Russia has already said that it expects Assad to go, doesn't see Assad in the future, but they're not proactively in this. Why? Because Russia runs a lot of its part of the world where it doesn't want foreign interference. China doesn't well. But when they get their price paid, they largely acquiesce and abstain from the actions and get out of the way. But right now, I don't see a military solution to what can happen in Syria. And until there is one, Russia can basically look big with doing nothing, sending ships, not a big deal. And I think if the United States were to intervene, or Turkey or others, because of the chemical weapons issues, Russia would, if there were a UN sanctions issue, completely back out of that, because I think they then worry about the kind of protocols they send. So once you actually have chemical weapons, and one of the questions is, why isn't the Obama administration publicizing this? That's why I would say let's wait till we see how this percolates, because obviously they hid it for a reason. Either they didn't want to take action, or they're not certain of the action, or they're planning an action, and when they do come out and announce it, that they were going to have a quick hit afterward. We just don't know the reality of that yet.
The question is what about Mali? But picking up from the role of the Russians and the Chinese as spoilers, they have not gotten in the way of UN affirmation of the French military action.
No.
So how do you see that? Because it just is not important to them.
It's out of their sphere of influence. It's out of their sphere of influence, right? There's no equity for them there. Look, there are about 2,000 or 3,000 Al-Qaeda style, heavily armed combatants that have essentially taken advantage of a failed state situation in northern Mali and have in a rapid period of time acquired and taken over a landmass larger than Afghanistan. It's almost inconceivable to think about what that means when you've got just 2,000 or 3,000 people. How do you even think about that? How do you do it? How do you sped your people? But the French became concerned that there was no infrastructure and no response holding back the roll of progress that they were making. So the French just injected 3,000 troops with US and British support, moving some of these folks into it to basically stop the move of Al-Qaeda, who are very heavily armed with materials, mostly from Libya, but turns out also from Iran. And we don't know where it's going to go. And so now the French have an awkward situation where they're in Mali. They've got planes there, but they had to the French ambassador told me they had to kind of pick them up here and there. The British provided 2 C-17 aircraft, one of which broke down in Paris, no joke.
Quel dommage.
I was on the phone with the White House this morning. I need to be careful since we're on tape, but the person I was talking to sort of joked, see, that's what defense cuts get you, broken down airplanes, you know. And but they moved things, and so the French last night, the ambassador was telling me that, you know, one of the things they need to do is they got to get other troops in this. They've got to get other troops to come in, and nobody wants to send troops, not from the Western countries. And so the question is, how do you stand up, train, outfit, and get in someone from the African Union to come in? And that's going to take time. So the French are in a situation that is complicated, and it was wild. So I think this was the day before yesterday all this happened. So the French incursion happened. On the same day, there was a French citizen they tried to attempt in Somalia to rescue them. The hostage was killed. The United States also gave backup support for that, and our aircraft went into Somali airspace. So you had these 2 letters from the White House filed with the Congress over war powers resolution consultations to let the Congress know that we had done these things. And we're getting these emails from the White House saying, we've done this, and all of us saying, what? 2 places in Africa, same day? Are these tied together? And it began to create this impression that maybe the U.S. is much more deeply engaged for potential ramp up in Africa than people had acknowledged. Well, the White House got on the phone with me this morning to say, Steve, we know you write about these issues a lot. Don't believe it. The president is that even though this was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and even though everyone talks about Al-Qaeda going around, this is not in our sphere of influence. This is French sphere of influence. We did provide limited background support. We're not going to continue to provide that kind of support. We are not vulnerable to this kind of issue, and the president is defining the line here very cautiously, that despite these games on the ground with Al-Qaeda in Mali and the dangers there, they're not a direct danger to the equities and interests of the United States, and thus we are not really going to militarily invest and create a new channel for exposure on this. That's a remarkable statement to come from a White House and a president in the time of the so-called ongoing battle against terror, particularly Al-Qaeda, clearly affiliated Al-Qaeda terrorists. So we're going to have very limited side there. The British are in the same situation where the ambassador of the UK told me that they did provide the same kind of logistics and transportation support, but they too want to limit their support. So the French are out there, and the French get the credit for having taken a bold decision and step it forward in their own interest in carrying this out. but their economy is in a shambles, and this can really backfire and things could go badly. So we just don't know how the story's going to. We're just in the front end of it. But it is a fascinating thing to happen, and it reminds people that you may be an executive in the most powerful executive in the world, in this White House, but you're constantly having to struggle with the tension between being drawn into things you didn't expect or plan and having to react to the memo screaming on your desk versus a strategy that you put in place trying to get your bureaucracies in other countries seduced to come along with you. That's the tension between strategy and a reactive foreign policy and national security position. And it's just if you lived in the White House, as I've heard people, tell me, it's a very, very hard balance to keep your focus on that, because it's so hard to ignore interest groups talking about human rights violations in Mali or the rights of women in Afghanistan that are going to be forfeited when you see warlords rise and Taliban take over, or you see what is going on in Syria and the real horrors that are there, and why can't the United States just fix these things? And so the president is making a very clear decision to downsize our exposure in those issues and to pick it up in other areas. And that's very controversial. And so he'll pay a political price at some level for some of that. It's not going to be, you'll never get unanimous support for that in the United States. There's sort of war fatigue in the United States that's giving him some room to run on this. But at some level, people will come back and say, why isn't the United States standing by people who can't protect themselves? And that'll be a problem.
Well, let me follow up on that, because there was a French official that was quoted earlier today of saying, well, we don't want to get entangled in Mali, but we may not have a choice.
They don't have a choice.
And
they just did it.
Right. But and they're going to get drawn in more as much as they would like to kind of get in and get out. And we've had many experiences in our own history where we've said we're going to get in and get out, but we never quite got out. And we kept having to escalate. Given, and I'm thinking of Libya in the background as well, but given, and I think it was Mr. Panetta who said yesterday something to the effect of, we do have an interest in this issue because we cannot allow Al-Qaeda.
He was countermanded by the White House today.
What's that?
He was countermanded by the White House today.
That wouldn't surprise me. But my question is, so we do have this notion out there that we're not going to allow Al-Qaeda affiliates to create its own little safe haven somewhere else. So at what point, and I guess this is a rhetorical question, but if the French fail in Mali, can we walk away? Then it becomes a question of walking away from the French.
I don't think so, because we're telling the French we're not going in. We will not have walked away. This is the French to deal with or not. I think the broader problem is if the French fail and they get pushed out, the French empire continues its long collapse. I think that...
Seems to me we said that in 1954 after Dien Bien Phu, but that was...
No, but part of it is colonial legacy, right? So part of it is colonial legacy. And the other part of it is if Mali were to do things that demonstrably put it forward to look like Yemen, then it changes the equation entirely, and then I think you'll see a lot of drones come over and begin. But the problem is that the authorizations for what we're doing in Yemen, what we've done with disrupting terror groups, and the congressional authorization for that will close with, in my opinion, many people will argue, will close with a punctuation point and an end of combat operations in Afghanistan. So in spring of this next year, the end of combat operations, those kinds of authorization will do in a close, because the stated objective was Al-Qaeda and affiliates. But the president has decided not to be the permanent war guy. Like we thought we're going to be a permanent war. This created a resolution to ever go after the same groups and crowds. And I don't think the president wants that to happen, so he'll bring it to a close. So we'll get back more to a piecemeal, ad hoc dance between the White House and Congress over congressional authorizations for long-term military action. But of course, these have to be actions. I don't know. I think it's 60 days, right. War powers. So the president is very clearly becoming surgical in some of these things, and we're going to have to figure out how to codify how drones fit into that. How is the extraterritorial deployment of force in the national interest to protect the rights and interests of American citizens in America in times of crisis, whatever that is. How do you manage the legal contraptions around that? This is really one of the big issues of the day. The public, I think, is totally bored by it, but it is a huge, huge question once these authorizations for the kinds of things that we're doing essentially are punctuated as having expired. And we're nearing that. And I think that's what makes situations like Mali much more complicated.
Yeah. There's a little question in the back. Super.
Could you just walk us around the globe and tell me where are there true Al-Qaeda, what would you call Al-Qaeda affiliates? Where are they? And what's the difference between them and terrorists?
Huge question. Walk around the globe.
Well,
Where are Al-Qaeda affiliates as opposed to
my colleague and
other
friend
kinds?
Peter Bergen, who tracked down bin Laden in 1997 when the CIA couldn't find him, is so much more of an expert on this than I am. But in the Maghreb, in North Africa, there are genuine outreach. You know, what you have is, you know, one of the real consequences of not having nailed Zawahiri and bin Laden in Tora Bora is that the movement metastasized. And it metastasized into a lot of units that learned the techniques. And there was a book by Peter Bergen called Holy War, Inc. So they learned the methodology and system of being able to do these things and sort of self-initiated and selected this. The reason that they are considered Al-Qaeda affiliates is that they were in direct communication and coordinated in part by the central Al-Qaeda leadership. And Ayman al-Zawahiri is still actually at large and still ostensibly playing some role. We haven't found him. It's remarkable. So in the Maghreb, but you have down in Africa expansion of groups that want to be, and you also have these odd groups both in the Philippines and in Indonesia that continue in sort of a bare bones. So they don't get a lot of attention, but they're there. There are a lot of other terrorist groups in the world that are unaffiliated terrorist groups. There are tons of terrorist groups in Pakistan and India that are essentially horrible operations that are essentially designed to continually terrorize Pakistanis and inside India. I was at a dinner once with former President Musharraf, who talked about Lashkar-e-Taiba, the very nasty group that engineered the Mumbai attacks. And he expressed some degree of astonishment that America cared so much about this, because this was essentially something as bad as it was, and he used all the politically correct language to talk about his disgust at what happened. It was nonetheless an affair between India and Pakistan, and by the way, India had much worse than Lashkar-e-Taiba. So there are lots of groups out there, but we don't have legal authorization to just go out and knock off these groups. We have counterterrorism units that are trying to track and develop databases and systems of following all of these groups. But our authorizations are pretty much focused on the Al-Qaeda groups and increasingly a narrower band of Al-Qaeda groups that are specifically targeted and threatening the United States. Now, one of the really interesting sleights of hand, and to show you the change in day that we're in, is that when David Petraeus was running the show in his sphere.
Which show?
Yeah, well, Central Command.
Oh, okay, that show. Okay.
Afghanistan.
Right.
The language they used was very careful. When we were at war, it was Al-Qaeda and its affiliates.
Right.
That was a shorthand way of saying Taliban. The Taliban was our enemy. And very quickly in the press, because people got tired of saying Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, we just began saying Taliban. We're at war with the Taliban. After the surge was brought to a definitive end, we stopped saying Taliban as our enemy. We began talking about the Taliban in a different way. And to hear the president talk at the Karzai summit about the Taliban office in Qatar without mentioning any of the other baggage is a remarkable shift. So the Taliban are no longer in the rhetoric of Washington's national security circles a part, so-called, of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates with which we continue to be at war. And people, it may sound almost Orwellian, but Orwellian distinctions matter, and so it gives us space to begin thinking about alternative futures and negotiated compromises, essentially deal making with parts of the Taliban that are quite different. But I know that's not the walk around the globe you would like to have, because there are Chechen groups that are allegedly Al-Qaeda affiliated, but I'm not tied into all of them. But there are the National Terrorism National Counterterrorism Center has a good website where it does list a lot of these affiliates, and it's a good resource to go and take a look at. My problem has always been the list is too long, and that many of these are engaged in other kinds of issues and other sorts of grievances. And the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, in a way, became a brand name that others wanted to associate or affiliate with because it was a quick way to get news or recognition and to look again, in terms of the theater of all of this, as a legitimate and strong, well-endowed, potentially well-resourced piece fighting whatever fight they may be in whatever obscure country they may have been. So part of this is that we've created, to some degree, the celebritization of Al-Qaeda, and that has created a lot of the affiliate problem that we've had. I'm not sure we could have done differently, but I do think it was a problem.
I saw a hand right here, yes, and then we'll come over here.
A lot more punditry today than there is investigative reporting, but there's great investigative reporting. Dana Priest of the Post found the secret prisons. Dana Priest wrote about intelligence. I mean, there are great investigative reporters out there, but that tradition is becoming rarer and rarer, and there are more people with very little experience or understanding who can go easily grab this or that strand and not have it tested. That's not the question of how to, groups decide what to report. I think that it is a complicated factor where news organizations have become hybrid, and they become hybrid with having very high quality reporters, and then, crusaders who have attitude and a view, and essentially are almost like political operatives who write pieces, and these coexist at the Washington Post, they coexist at the New York Times, and they coexist to some degree at the Atlantic, although I think that we handle it better, although we managed today to run a Scientology paid ad that brought hell down on our head. I had nothing to do with it. Got so much hate mail about this today, but for 12 hours we apparently had one of these kind of complex integrated ads paid for by Scientology. I don't know the whole story, but boy, was it a mistake. But I think in terms of classic reporting or writing, you have people like me where I'm essentially an opinion journalist, but occasionally I delve in and I get leaks and material, and you have to use your journalistic strengths and skills to go out and tell as honest and real and as objective a story as you can. And hopefully in my own punditry, I also try to keep an open voice. I praised Grover Norquist on Rachel Maddow's show on Friday night. I mean, did you see that show? Did you hear me do that, right? Yeah, people were shocked. She got so much message. Oh my God, you are fair and balanced. You had a guy praising Grover Norquist on Rachel Maddow. And I praised Grover Norquist for being the one to raise the cost of the Afghanistan war on Jon Stewart in a way that conservatives had never heard before. It changed the calculus in the country. It's interesting. And so didn't have to do that. And you have a lot of people, if you watch these shows, that are just live in self-reinforcing, attitude-reinforcing cocoons. And you have increasingly people with completely different worldviews, and you wonder, how can that person be sane and have the worldview they have? Well, it's because there's so much reinforcement, so much material information where they can live in that world, and it's completely different than yours. And so I don't blame them for that, but it's very important to realize that everything that may be happening to you in our own self-reinforcement may be happening with someone else. And I think we need to be bigger than that and try and find ways. I was on C-SPAN for 1 hour and 40 minutes on Sunday morning on Washington Journal, talking about the life and career of Chuck Hagel, which is controversial for some people, with a guy I've known for years named Gary Schmidt. We often beat each other up in the press in friendly ways, who is the executive director of something called the Project for a New American Century. And Gary is very close with Bill Kristol and has been part of the neoconservative movement. And we had a wonderful, civil, tough-minded, serious discussion for 1 hour and 40 minutes with Steve Scully on Washington Journal about Chuck Hagel. And we showed how it could be done. We need more examples of that. But we got the mail we got on that was how rare that is. That sucks. That's a sad thing. And that's why I really support what Foerster was doing in Pittsburgh with high school students, because you saw these students learning how to have civil, polite, but serious discussions where they disagreed. And that ethic is vital if you want to get back to a kind of responsible governance and begin shaming the idiotic behavior of people on both sides of the aisle who make decisions. I've been reading these op-eds by senators about Chuck Hagel. Yeah, I don't care if a senator opposes Chuck Hagel. Fine, oppose Chuck Hagel. But listen to the hearing. You're in the United States Senate. You have a formal procedure called a hearing where questions are posed. Any other senator can inject questions in the process. You hear the answers. It's a wonderful process. Where are all these people basically saying they're already pro or con? You know, it's one of the reasons why I like John McCain so much. I like John McCain. John McCain is not a big fan of Chuck Hagel anymore. They used to be best friends. And people know that deep down is this burning, smoldering anger that McCain has for Hagel having defected from John McCain's demands about the Iraq surge and that ideology at the moment. But McCain hasn't said he's going to vote against Hagel because he wants to hear the hearing. He's still old school enough that he's paying attention. Senator Wicker goes out and says, there's no way I'm going to vote for this. John Cornyn goes out and says, there's no way I'm going to vote for that. I'm like going, don't be an imbecile. You're a United States senator. Follow the processes that you were paid to learn to do, because you're going to be up for an appointment someday, and you're going to want people who don't quite know you to listen to your views and if you're constructive or not. That's what I think is really sad about the institutional dimensions of American democracy today, is that you're getting more mob behaviors than you are getting processes that were set up to intermediate the views of the public in a fair and honest way. And that, it really is upsetting.
We are at our bewitching hour, but this gentleman has been very patient, so we're going to give him the last question.
Yeah, it's dumb. It's dumb because Latin America is so interesting. Brazil is so fascinating. It's our backyard. There's a lot of economic vitality, and I don't have a good answer. I can say that I think Latin America is neglected at our peril, that there's a lot of great and interesting things that happen there. There's a former finance minister of Venezuela who was the long-term editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, Moises Naim. He's not there now, but he was at Carnegie Endowment. He organizes something called the G50 annually to bring in leading Latin American business leaders, government officials, others to Washington to kind of kick Washington around and say, hey, we're here, we matter, we have all this business, deal with us. And you know, and you've got people like Mac McClarty and some of so there's an infrastructure in Washington, but it's always struggling to get out of being the kind of forgotten boutique thing. You know, there are two areas of the world that are wrongly neglected. Japan is the most neglected vital ally of the United States, the sort of forgotten ally. And Latin America is the most important neglected continent. It's vital to the United States in many ways, and it is often a punching bag. I remember when Senator Jim DeMint went down, I guess it was to Honduras, and basically made remarkable statements, I wrote at the time, because he was advising the Honduras government at the time to ignore the State Department's edicts on some stuff. So it's one thing to do that on the floor of the Senate, the new president of the Heritage Foundation, by the way, right. And it's another thing to go out and actually try to get a foreign government to countermand and stand against the State Department of your own country and not get called out on it. You know, it's really a remarkable thing. But Arturo Valenzuela is a great guy. I don't know if you sound like you do Latin America a lot. He was our former Assistant Secretary for Western Hemispheric Affairs. And I did do a lot of work on Cuba. I think the Cuba embargo is the most idiotic vestige of the Cold War that still exists. And I'm willing to say that to Bob Menendez and to Marco Rubio and others that believe they still need to play a very old politics, but there's generational change. When I go down to Florida, Miami, and you see these young Cuban Americans that are growing that are jealous of Cubans that have moved and emigrated to other countries that are now doing business inside Cuba, there's a lot of opportunity there. And if you look at what's happened in Vietnam, the economic growth and prosperity and the opportunity, the moment we open up and get rid of that embargo and begin opening up serious ties, the Castros are gone. I mean, the government won't be able to keep up with the issues. So what's interesting is the embargo is the most Castro-protecting policy that we have. It's bizarre. But I also thought that when Obama came in, he'd made some statements along these lines. He never really lived up to them. And that it would be an interesting and useful demonstration project. There are 11 million Cubans, but it continues to have throw weight and echo effect in global affairs much larger than it is. And a lot of Latin America was looking for a more progressive and enlightened policy from the United States with that, just as a measure of what they would do. I was in the Dominican Republic the other day, and the outgoing president of the Dominican Republic, I met him and spent some time with him, and he has good relations with all the presidents, but they basically live with institutionalized neglect, and they get used to it. And it's terrible. So I don't know how to fix it. I just know it's wrong. And I think that America tends to be drawn to places that are problems and tends to be trouble. And that's why if you are a nation, I'll tell you a story. Turkmenistan used to be just dirt in the eyes of the White House. Like, didn't know. There was like time, many people look at this area of the world, the Stans region, as the great race, the race with oil and oil. Well, before that all happened, before Bob Kaplan wrote his book and, people began taking the area more seriously, I was director of the Nixon Center. And we opened our office in Washington. Bill Clinton came and gave a big speech. We opened the DC in early 1995. And the ambassador of Turkmenistan, so former Soviet Republic, becomes independent, brought me this beautiful, giant portrait painting of something that was just gorgeous, but I didn't know DC ethics laws, and I just didn't know if I should accept it. And I said, I can't accept this. And he says, you have to. You're the only ones who take us seriously because we don't have nuclear weapons. And they couldn't get on people's radar screen. And so what you realize is that inadvertently, the great powers in the world tend to focus on problem states, tend to give money to problem states. So you reinforce the bad behaviors of rogue states, whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, North Korea, Libya, Gaddafi, right? If you create problems and drive the needle in a negative way, if you're somewhere in the middle, you get no attention. And that's the problem with Latin America. They're mostly, Hugo Chavez tried to change that and to become a problem child, but we basically didn't think he had that much. His influence was limited. Even as he began flirting with the Chinese and Russians, it wasn't serious. And so he was largely in a box. So unless a Latin American nation can really rise up, and I thought when Lula was there in Brazil, he's the first person in Latin America in decades to really stick it to the United States and to cause pain. And that was over the Iran negotiating issue when Turkey and Brazil began to freelance in negotiating with Iran on the Tehran research reactor deal. We were livid and furious, but believe me, we began paying attention to Lula more in Brazil for a while. Now we're not. So it's basically the problem child gets attention, and it's a very unfortunate
one of the things, when I was your age, there was a movie called The Mouse That Roared, so some of you may actually want to go find it. I'm going to draw a line here because we could continue this all night. I haven't yet found an issue in which Steve Clemons didn't know 5 layers deeper than anybody else. So we don't want to get him started on anything else, except we'll have private, softer conversations here. For all of you in the audience, this is the Colorado Springs version of the coveted globe. Now, you have about 4 of these from Pittsburgh, but you don't have one from Colorado Springs.
No, I don't.
And actually, you are the very first recipient of the coveted Colorado Springs World Affairs Council globe. Steve, thanks very much for all that you've done for us.
Can I say, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. And I know that in some of the comments I made that they were flip and humorous. I do think these are really serious issues. I try to bring a little humor to them sometimes. Now I'm a little off color, on occasion. But I do really appreciate communities that take these issues so seriously. It's fantastic. Not enough of it happens. And so thanks for having me. And Sky, you do a great job, and thanks to all of you. And thanks for those folks helping the high school students in the program. It's such a vital program, and I hope you guys in Reykjavik do really well. I hope you all come back and you can get up here and tell your Reykjavik stories to everyone. So thank you very, very much.
And the bar is open. Thank you.